Okay, let's get rolling here. Welcome. Today we're going to be reviewing and going over the as-is residential contract, some of the best practices and fields and clauses in here that can really impact your transaction as far as being likely to be accepted, and even going further than that, more likely to actually close and go through. So as we go along, if you have questions, raise your hand. If you're tuning in online, simply chat in the box. Tommy. If you have any questions, please chat them in the box, the comment field, or raise your hand here, and we will go through them. So let's just get running straight through it. As you pull up the as-is contract, it is the most commonly form of sales and purchase contract utilized in our marketplace in Florida. This is a standardized form that has been created by Florida Realtors for us, created by the attorneys. And remember that our ability to actually complete this form is to fill in the blanks. We cannot write a unique contract. We must be able to fill in the blanks appropriately. But there's a lot that can really change as it goes to that. So we want to be very, very careful and pay attention. So as we start the agreement, at the top line, we have our first section, which is the seller. Now, what I commonly see as a mistake in this section is someone simply saying, I'm listing with this person or this husband and wife and filling in their information. It's really important for you to verify how title is held on the property, so the contract that you are writing will be legally enforceable. So the first item is to cross-reference whichever property you're writing an offer on with the property tax record. Research that in the property appraiser and copy exactly how it appears on the property appraiser's record onto the contract. Let's say it's a corporation. That's okay as well. You can copy the corporation name in there, but then you want to go a step further. Make sure the person who's signing the contract has the legal authority to sign on behalf of the LLC or the corporation, whomever you are committing to that. In order for you to find that information, it's very easy. You can search the corporation name on sunbiz.org and verify who the registered agent or the manager or the corporation is, excuse me. So number one is make sure you're working with the appropriate parties in the transaction. There are two parties in this transaction, a seller and a buyer, okay? The seller, we just talked about how to verify. And on the buyer side, it's of course how your buyer or your customer intends to receive title. For example, I spoke with an agent last night who has a sale and purchase contract under one person's name. However, he would like his partner to be on that contract as well. That requires additional documentation if you don't do it from the get-go. So ask your customer, is it going to be owned only under you, or will it be owned by multiple people? How would you like title to be written? This is exactly how it will go. All right. Moving down to our next section, we have section 1, which is the property description. This is the physical address of the property. A lot of this information will auto-populate depending on how you write your contract, whether it's through Form Simplicity, Transaction Desk, Dot Loop, SkySlope, all of those. The majority of those do auto-populate from the tax records. So you will see the physical address, the county, the tax ID, and the legal description all automatically populate into this section from those various records. If you have to manually write that in, God help you, number one. But number two, you can verify that information again through the property tax record and the MLS sheet. Both of those have this information that you're looking for. The most important piece of this property description is actually the legal description itself. That is the really real end of the line, absolute governing over the contract. If you mess up the physical address, it's okay, because the legal description will govern over that. So it's important to get the legal description correct. All right. Moving down into section D of section 1, personal property. You hover over that. Of personal property. You'll notice that a lot of items are listed inside of this section: range, oven, refrigerator, dishwasher, disposal. a lot of the common appliances and contents, drapery, window treatment, smoke detectors, garage door openers, storm shutters, very appropriate with Dorian on its way. But then there's an open section of additional personal items that will be included with the sale. Now there are 3 common items that are included in a purchase that are not listed on here, and they will cause you issues as part of your transaction. So looking at that list, can you come up with 3 items that are not listed on there? Washer, dryer, one more. Microwave, good job. So those are the 3 items. If there's a washer, a dryer, and a microwave inside the home, whether it's attached to the house or not, like the microwaves that go in as a range fan above the range, those are still not necessarily included. So you must include washer, dryer, you can type that out, washer, dryer, and microwave into this section. The issues that I have seen is when you forget to include that, the savvy agent and seller on the other side, you'll show up to a pre-closing walkthrough and oops, where's the washer dryer? They're gone. Unless it is written into this section, you cannot enforce that stuff to stay there. Regardless if they were in the MLS pictures or not, the contract terms govern. So if you are if you're buying a fully furnished property, for example, remove that stuff, and instead of washer, dryer, and microwave, you would include all interior furnishings or inventory to be provided within 3 days of effective date, something like that. So the seller will provide an inventory within 3 days of the offer acceptance on what is exactly included. You had a question? Mm-hmm. Well, remember, so the question was, if you know for a fact that some of these pre-printed items will not be included or are not there, what should you do? Should you modify them? Not necessarily, because we as realtors cannot modify the pre-printed information. We can only utilize the blanks. So in order to provide transparency, you could actually use the next, which are the item exclusions, and write in there what is not being included. For example, you've got fixtures, and occasionally a seller wants to keep a sentimental fixture, something they brought from overseas or custom ordered or something like that. That's where you would include that. Brazilian chandelier does not convey, something along those lines. Okay. Correct. Right. Great question. Going back to that top line, line number 2 for the buyer. If there is one person going on the loan, you can still have other people on the title. I'll give you an example. When I bought my first house, I was the only one on the loan. My wife was not. However, we put title in both of our names. So the contract was in both of our names. However, the financing was still only in mine. So the contract will govern over how title is received, not necessarily the terms of the loan. Okay, that can still be separate. Great question. Okay, so those are the major items as far as it relates to the property description, personal property being included or excluded. I highly, highly push you to make sure you are reviewing these sections when you receive an offer on your listing. It is very easy for you to miss pre-printed or pre-written materials in there, like condo fully furnished, for example. And if you don't review that section, simply send it on to your seller, they are relying on you to understand the terms of the agreement. And I have seen it a few times where it includes fully furnished and they don't notice and you didn't notice, and now we have a big issue on our hands. And it's a lot harder to resolve after the fact. So make sure you're paying attention to those sections. Those are 2 of a few that we really want to make sure you pay attention to. Okay, moving down to section 2, we have the purchase price breakdown. I really like the way that this is drawn out. It's very easy and clear for us to spell out exactly how this is going to go. So let's say we're making an offer on a property for $500,000. Our next line down would be our initial escrow deposit or earnest money. Now, there is no real rule of thumb as far as how much you should be putting down. It really depends on the makeup of the transaction. So let's say, we'll do a first example here. Let's say this is a conventional financing. Conventional financing, they're putting down anywhere between 5 and 20% on their loan. So what would be enough that the seller feels you're really married into the contract, but not too much that you're putting your buyer at risk for any potential issue that comes up. At 500,000, their deposit's going to be anywhere between, I'd say 5 to 20,000. Anywhere in that number is a very confident feeling on the other side that you're putting enough skin in the game, you're putting enough down that you're in the deal, you're locked in. You're not just going to walk away from $5,000 to $20,000. I really do not like when I receive offers or see offers with $1,000 as an escrow deposit. It's very easy for someone to turn around and walk away from $1,000. That's whether you're on the buying side or the selling side. It's very easy to walk away from that.
Okay. I feel like some patients that their escrow deposit is like for your finance. Because I had an agent, I think probably like
Mm-hmm.
and we was putting like 5,000. And he said no. But he was the listing agent
Right.
and the seller.
Right. He said that wasn't sufficient.
Yeah, so he was like, no, you're supposed to put 5% down for the loan. I'm like, yeah, but it's the escrow. That's
Right.
basically like you said, showing you got skin in the game and we're serious. Obviously, you have to put a decent amount down, but
Yeah,
I've had it happen to me a couple times.
there's different ways to structure it. So yes, I agree. There is definitely confusion, and there's a lot of confusion, especially from realtors who think they know better. There's a lot, but we're going to talk about exactly what it actually means. And sometimes, the hardest part of the real estate transaction is the other agent you have to work with. So sometimes it's educating them as to what it really means. Correct. 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 As a rule of thumb for me personally, I always put between 5 and 20 on that first deposit. So let's say, Tommy, can you put in 5,000 on that first deposit for me? Okay. Now, the way that I like to break down deposits is somewhere between 5 and 20 on the initial, but then down here on line 36, I include an additional deposit. Okay, once we've passed through our inspection period, we know we're moving forward, I'll put more down. So the 5,000 is for me to hold it. Let me get my inspections done. Let me check out the condition of the property. And then from there, we'll go on and we'll put more money down. We are serious. We are going to continue moving forward. Yes.
Instead of lesser than 5,000 initially.
You put 15 down here.
But I always do it in class. Let's say I would say $3,000, $2,000 on acceptance of contract.
Correct. We're still in that section, so don't jump ahead of me yet. So we're here. Right. We're still up here now. I was talking about a breakdown of the 5,000 to 15,000 as kind of a buffer where on a $500,000 deal, 5,000 probably isn't enough deposit, right? But I don't know if my buyer's going to move forward. We don't know the condition of the house. We don't know exactly what we're looking at. So 5,000 is an easy number for them to write a check and move forward, right? And then give yourself some time to complete the inspections before they put down more money. So if you look at this contract right now, okay, as it stands right now, it's a cash transaction. $500,000, $5,000 due after signing, and $15,000 additional. So I'm putting down a $20,000 deposit on a $500,000 purchase. That's a pretty valid amount. I would feel very confident seeing that on the other side. Now let's go back to that first initial deposit in section 2A. It states initial deposit to be held in escrow in the amount of blank, which we put in 5,000, and that this amount will either accompany the offer or is to be made within a certain amount of time. I will never check a company's offer unless it is a very, very highly desirable property with multiple offers. Because I want to show how serious I am, I'm going to include a copy of the check or an escrow letter inside that initial offer. Typically, you'll select this second box here, which defaults to 3 days after acceptance. And let's talk about those 3 days. So today is Thursday. Let's say our contract is executed today. our 3 days would be Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Because Sunday is a weekend, it actually moves our deadline to Monday at 5 p.m. Monday is also a holiday. It's Labor Day. So it would be Tuesday at 5 p.m. On a normal weekend, it would be Monday at 5 p.m., but Monday being a holiday makes it Tuesday at 5 p.m. It is, everything in here is calendar days. However, the majority of the dates cannot end on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday. So it does push that deadline to 5 p.m. the following business day. So in this case, we would put that, I have to type a lot of that. So we would select that second box here that we're going to be making the deposit within 3 days after the effective date. And it is very important, regardless of who is selecting the title company, for you to include some information on the first page here. And if you're the listing agent and the buyer's agent hasn't filled that out, you want to find out and get that filled out. Who is going to be holding escrow? Who is holding that initial $5,000? Where does it have to be made? It's not necessarily, please do not ever write seller to be determined. Yeah, please do not ever write seller TBD, because that is just not appropriate. You're not defining who is going to be holding on to the escrow deposit. So you would want to list some company, some attorney, some title company, whoever is going to be holding that initial $5,000. So it's very clear as to who is responsible for that. Of course, we do have our in-house title company that holds escrow, regardless if you're closing with them or not. It can always be transferred out after the fact. Okay, providing contact information is also imperative to make sure that it can be verified. Make sure that they can verify, the listing agent can verify, and you can verify if it's your listing, who is holding the money and how to verify that this was done. Okay, one of the most common defaults of a contract is not making the escrow deposit in a timely manner. So it's very easy for us to verify when we do include that kind of information. All right. My next section here, the additional deposit. If you recall, we talked about an additional deposit of $15,000, giving us a total of $20,000 in escrow. This blank here is the time frame from effective date that this deposit would be due. If you are doing a 10-day inspection period, I personally would leave that blank. If you're doing a 15-day inspection period, I would extend that to 15 days. The idea being, my buyer can be more confident in their purchase of the property following inspections. So before they put down a big chunk of money as an escrow deposit that's tied into the property or tied into the transaction, I want to make sure that we verify condition and they will be moving forward. So this kind of structure is actually very, very common. One of the biggest mistakes that I do see on this financial breakdown is some agents believe that this balance to close on the bottom is the value of their loan, which is definitely incorrect. You'll notice on the financing line 38, it express as a dollar amount or percentage, quote, loan amount, see paragraph 8. Whenever you see in quotations like that, that is defining a term of the contract. So the term loan amount is being established on this line, and loan amount will be utilized in paragraph 8, which is our financing contingency. If we leave this blank and we include the financing contingency, our contract is contingent upon obtaining financing of $0. Tell me how you get out of that one. How do you get declined from getting no money? So make sure you can't put balance in this section. You do need to include a number. You put balance on the bottom, the very last line. So financing, you must include a dollar amount in that line right there, which I've placed 400. So these people are putting down, what is that, 20%? 100,000, 20%. So this is an 80-20 mortgage. They're contingent upon receiving approval for financing $400,000, and the balance of the 80 off of the initial 20 in escrow would be their cash to close. This does not include closing costs. This does not include lender's costs, lender's fees, nothing along those lines. This is simply the breakdown of the purchase price. Now, something I do want to point out in this section, if you noticed at the top, right next to the additional deposit, the initial deposit, checks are subject to collection. So whether the escrow deposit initially is made or not, these funds are still due if the buyer defaults. So let's say I left that $5,000 in the top, but the buyer never made their initial escrow deposit. The buyer is defaulting on the contract. The seller can actually sue them for that $5,000. Whether it was made or not, they can go after it. They're called collectible funds. So make sure you're following up with your customers and make sure that they get that deposit done and stay within contract, or cancel in a timely manner so they're not liable to make that deposit. Okay? You'll notice at the bottom of this section it says, for the definition of collection or collected, see standard S, which is later on in the contract, and talks about the ability for the seller to go after that money and collect that money regardless of being made or not. Okay? Moving down, section 3. Time for acceptance of offer and counter offers. There's only one blank field in this section, but we'll talk about what this all means. So the time for acceptance here is going to be the date in which you're expecting a response back from the seller. If the seller does not respond, your offer is null and void. If the seller does respond, whether verbal or in writing, that is considered a counter offer. All counter offers have 2 days of validity, meaning we make our offer today, the seller counters back today, we have 2 days, Friday, Saturday. Okay, counter offers are calendar days and may end on Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays. So the counter offer would expire if returned today on Saturday. If we do not respond by Saturday, any response that we give back to them is considered a new offer, not a counter offer. What's important to know about that is there are a few items that are essentially time-stamped at the time of offer, the commission offered in the MLS. Let's say today when I made my offer, the listing commission in the MLS was offered at 3%. And tomorrow they changed it to 2.5%. But we've been going back and forth, counter offering, going back and forth from seller to buyer, buyer to seller, etc. If we lapse that 2-day counter offer and they had changed to 2.5% in the meantime, we are now making a new offer and we're subject to the 2.5, not the 3. So it's important to stay in that chain of events of 48 hours or 2 days from receiving any type of counter offer to keep that chain of events keep going. Okay. Section B in this section defines effective date. The effective date is not always the last date on the contract that someone signed it. The effective date is defined as the last date that an initial or signature was completed and delivered to the other side. So let's say the seller signs it today. Our offer is stellar. We wrote such a stellar contract and offer that they accepted it, no counter offer today. But the realtor was busy. She doesn't send it to us until tomorrow. Our effective date is tomorrow, not today. You don't go back on the contract and change the date, but make note of when they emailed it back to you. That is your effective date. And it wouldn't be a bad idea for you to over communicate that to the other agent. Okay, contract received, today is our effective date. Or 8/30/19 is our effective date. Because that is establishing your baseline for how all of the other timelines will go. And one day, as you know, makes all the difference. Question? No? All right, moving down. Closing date. Unless modified by other provisions or addenda, this closing date will be the closing date. I love how they included this blank here and just the terminology that leads up to it. The contract will be closed or closing on blank. It was initially intended to be a defined date, but what you will commonly see here is someone writing out on or before. You will commonly see this. On or about? No. On or about is very vague because about could mean after the fact. And you can't have that. You need a defined end date. So on or before. Now, with that being said, your closing date here, even when you write on or before, is set at September 15th. if you would like to close early, it still must be a mutual consent. So the buyer can't say, oh, we can close any day before September 15th. No, the seller still has to agree to it. So there's not, you know, it looks nice to a seller. Yeah, you're willing to close early, but sometimes the seller needs all the time. So I still advise to write it this way. I still like writing or before. I think it's effective in a mindset with the seller because they know you're motivated, they know you're ready to go. As opposed to just a defined date. We have to wait until that date. They may want to close sooner. They may want to close later. But this will open that up and give you that real feeling of being motivated to close and able to close. Okay, section 5. This is one that most people do not know. So I want to make sure that I point this out to you. Section 5A here relates to when you have a financing contingency. So for argument's sake, we will say there is a financing contingency on a conventional mortgage for this $500,000 deal. Thank you, I'll take a referral on it. What this clause in here is saying is that if the funds are not available on your date of closing, September 15th, or there must be more of a waiting period to satisfy the CFPB requirements, which we all know the CD must be delivered and disclosed 3 days prior to closing, 3 business days prior to closing. If that timeline doesn't fit from when it was issued by the lender, this contract will automatically extend. No extension is needed. What I mean by that is we have our closing date of September 15th we established above. If the closing disclosure is issued by the lender on September 14th, you're not going to close on the 15th. However, you do not need an extension either. The buyer is not defaulting. The buyer is not out of contract. The contract closing date will automatically extend for those remaining 2 days that are necessary to satisfy that closing disclosure. So really pay attention because your drop dead date, as long as the lender is issuing your closing disclosure by the closing date, your contract will automatically extend. No extension needed. You'll see in that section, there is a period of 10 days allowable for this automatic extension. The reason being, things might change on that closing disclosure. It is issued, there might be a modification of a fee, a modification of their interest rate that requires a redisclosure. So the attorneys have done a great job in giving us 10 days, which is really the option of 3 changes to the closing disclosure and still be within contract. Questions about that? Yes, sir. Let's do it.
Okay. So basically, it's almost a nice thing for the buyer to know and the lender to know that they do have that extra period. If they need that time frame, then they're better off not to do the closing disclosure until 1 day before closing. Gives them more time.
If that's correct. So the question was, the point was that it's a great thing to have that in there, and it's nice to have that knowledge between the lender and the buyer so that they can have that extension if they do need time. Typically when a lender needs more time, it's not because that they're clear to close and just have to issue. It's typically something else, or a pending document or something that's still left on the conditions. So that wouldn't work. They have to be essentially clear to close and simply issuing the closing disclosure. So everything would have to be in, everything have to be provided to the lender, simply waiting for the time period or the waiting period for the closing disclosure to mature, I guess I'll call it. On the day of closing. You're still okay? If you're day after, buyer's in default because the closing disclosure was not issued prior to closing, there is no waiting period. You're already in default by the time the waiting period starts. Okay, good question. The second part of this section talks about force majeure, which obviously is very appropriate given our current climate. But we'll talk about that later when we get to the actual force majeure section of the contract. Okay. Moving down here, occupancy and possession. This clause has to do with when the property will be exchanged, when keys are going to be passed from seller to buyer, which is typically done at funding, which is closing, seller gets their wire sent out, here you go, here are your keys. That's how it works. You don't necessarily get keys at the table. Most sellers are willing to just hand that over. However, They can withhold those keys until money is sent to them, okay? But the big part of this clause, the big part of this section of the contract is section 6B, which talks about leasing or occupancy after closing. If the property is currently occupied by a tenant, meaning a valid lease on the property, it doesn't necessarily have to be a written lease. It could be month to month. If a tenant is occupying the property, this box at the beginning of this section must be checked. Let's talk about how that affects things. So whenever this box is checked, the seller has an additional responsibility. The seller must provide a copy of the written lease or understanding of the lease, as well as the rent roll, which means where they are in their payments. Are they up to date? Do they owe 2 months? Are they short $300 on their last rent payment? Whatever the status is, it's essentially a tenant estoppel. The status of the tenant with the landlord as it relates to the lease. So upon receiving the lease from the landlord or the seller within 5 days of the effective date, the buyer then has their own 5 days to say, okay, I'm going to look at that lease. I'm going to look at the terms, see what this tenant's like. Are they paying on time, et cetera? Do I want to take this liability? And they have 5 days to decide if it's acceptable to them or not. If it is acceptable, they don't have to say anything. They can just continue on their merry way and continue with the purchase. If it's not acceptable, they must terminate the contract during those 5 days. But if you think about it, 5 days for the landlord to provide the lease, 5 days for the buyer to approve. That's 10 total days. What else happens within 10 days to 15 days? Your inspection period. So regardless of what it says in here, your buyer will still have the out if they're unsatisfied with the terms of anything or the composition of anything until the end of their inspection period. Oh, we're going to get to the inspection period though. Okay, assignability, section 7. There are 3 boxes in this section. There is one I absolutely never want to see ever checked off, whether you're writing the offer or the seller or you're representing the seller. I never want to see this first one checked off. It just screams, I'm wholesaling your property. We have a question from the audience. Going back, if I didn't include the washer dryer in the contract, but it is included in the MLS, is that okay? It's okay, but that doesn't mean they have to leave the washer dryer. The contract governs over what happens. So regardless of what's listed in the MLS, if it said washer and dryer included in the MLS, you need to write it into the contract. If you don't put it in the contract, you cannot obligate the seller to leave those items in the property. So it's okay, they're communicating with you what they're conveying, but you must translate that into the contract. Thank you for your question. Going back to assignability. I would never, ever, ever, never, never, ever check that first box. If you are the listing agent and you receive an offer with that box checked off, what are you thinking? They're trying to resell the contract. I'm trying to get it under contract at a certain price. I'm going to find somebody else to assign the contract to, and I'm out. I'm not responsible. I still don't want to check it. Yep, still don't want to check it. What I would do is assign check number 2. Check number 2 is kind of a comfort medium. It's you may assign the contract, but I'm still going to be liable for the terms. Okay. Actually, going back when you're talking about wholesaling, that $1,000 deposit on escrow also screams, I'm trying to do something else because I don't want to risk my money. But checking this second one has a few different purposes why you would select this second one. So may assign but not be released from liability under this contract. If I'm writing the property up with myself as the buyer, but it's an investment property, I'm going to rent it out. I want to put that property into a corporation. I don't want to buy it under my personal name. So using this second box allows me to assign the contract to my corporation as I establish that during the contract process. Otherwise, I'll have to do a completely separate addendum, doing a name change of the buyer, et cetera, et cetera. While if I check this second one, I can simply assign it to my corporation. Make sense? Okay. The last one is the most solid, which is, nope, not going to sign this. It's my purchase. It's for me only, and that's it. You can always modify that. You can always modify the name of the buyer. You can always put it into a corporation name, but it will require a separate addendum to do so. Okay.
Normally you check the two box off.
The second or the third. The second one gives you some flexibility. And it's not really a red flag when you check the second one because it is very common to put it into a corporation. It could be common to put it into a trust. So there's different flexibilities by checking the second box. If you know it's, for example, an FHA buyer, they're going to live there, they have to live there, it's for themselves, it's going to be their home, the third one's perfectly fine. There's no difference for you between the second and the third at that point. The second one allows you some flexibility if you need to maneuver things around. So that's more on the investment side of things. That third box is really for an owner occupant. Moving down, financing section. This is a big one. Notice how long it is. Financing contingencies, okay? Section A at the top is normally selected when it's a cash transaction, but that doesn't always mean the case. By selecting the first item, the buyer can still go out and get a loan. They can still go and do hard money, they can do a conventional mortgage, they can do cash. But the deal is not contingent on them getting approved for that financing. So let's say that first box is checked and they go apply for a mortgage. Whether they get approved or not, they're still liable for fulfilling the terms of the contract, okay? In addition, by checking that first box, the extension that we talked about above, about that CFPB extension right here, this does not govern, this does not apply if you select 8A. Notice in the paragraph above, it says if paragraph 8B is checked. So only if you select that the contract is contingent upon financing will that apply. So remember that. However, typically in practice, you see the first box in this financing section checked if it's a cash deal, and you'll see the second one checked if it's a financing deal. Very extenuating circumstances if it's otherwise, okay? That second box here must be checked. This line 86B must be checked for the rest of this to be applicable. What I've seen in the past is this first box not be checked, but then they say conventional financing, fixed rate, 30 days, and all of the terms inside here. You say, wait a minute. This is contingent upon receiving approval for conventional financing within 30 days with a fixed rate mortgage. No, it's not. Unless you check this first box here, none of the rest applies. That one little checkbox could have a drastic impact on the contract. So make sure you're checking this first box before you fill in anything that's after the fact, okay? Now, the different types of financing here, you've got conventional, FHA, VA, or other. Anything that you check off, the buyer is obligated to apply for. So if you check off conventional and FHA and VA, you're not giving your buyer the ability to fluctuate between whichever one they want in the end. You're obligating them to apply for all of them. Let's say you check off all three and you get a denial for conventional. Guess what? You haven't gotten a denial for the rest. Did you apply? Your buyer could be in default. So find out what they're doing. If you check off conventional here and they switch to FHA, that's okay. That's okay. But if you need to use this as an out to the contract, you'll need a denial for the financing. Excuse me, you won't even need a denial as the contract's written now. In the old days, you would need a denial. You don't need one anymore. To explain that to you a little bit more detailed, the financing contingency in here no longer requires what used to be called a loan commitment. A loan commitment doesn't exist anymore. Everything is called a loan approval now. In order for the buyer to be able to cancel or exercise this contingency, they do not need to have a denial. The buyer has X amount of days, which we filled in here as 30. The buyer has X amount of days after the effective date to attempt to secure a loan approval. At any time during those 30 days, as long as they are providing diligent effort to secure that mortgage, at any time during that 30 days, they can say, we haven't gotten it yet, we're out, cancel. They have every right to do that within those 30 days. On day 30, that expires. And if you have not notified the other side, which doesn't necessarily have to be in writing, that can be verbal, saying, yeah, we've been approved, the loan has been approved. If you do not notify the seller of a loan approval, The seller then has day 31, 32, and 33 to say, you haven't given us a loan approval. We don't think you're going to close. Cancel. That is a very short timeline that the seller actually has the right to cancel this agreement. There are not many places for the seller to cancel the sales contract. In the loan approval period, there is. After the 30 days, day 31, 32, and 33. Let's say you shorten your loan approval period to 20 days. It's day 21, 22, and 23. It's 3 days following. You had a question. Great question. So on days 31, 32, and 33 of this contract, if the seller cancels, the buyer is refunded their deposit. If the seller doesn't do anything on day 31, 32, and 33, the financing contingency is considered waived and everybody's progressing to closing. If the buyer then subsequently fails to close, unless there's some other type of title defect or something else along the way, the buyer must close. If they do not, they are in default and the seller may make a claim on their deposit. Yes.
So if the closing date is the day after the 30 days, 31st day, they don't close. They don't close. Does the seller have to wait a couple more days also before they can claim on deposit?
Question is, if you have a closing date 31 days after your effective date, the loan approval period expires on day 30 and the buyer did not notify the seller of a loan approval, right? Day 31, which is the day of closing, the seller could actually cancel the day of closing. If the buyer doesn't come to closing, the buyer's in default. The seller could cancel on day 31, the closing day, but the buyer would be refunded the deposit if they did that. The seller would be very foolish to do that. Not even 2 or 3, as long as the closing date has passed. This all dies, this whole section dies at closing. So if day 31 is the date of closing, they can either cancel and move on, or they can wait till the end of that day, and then the buyer's in default and they can go after the deposit. Great question. Okay. The key part of this is that the buyer must apply. The buyer must apply for their financing, which defaults up here to 5 days. I'm going to type it in there just for demonstration purposes. But they must make their application for that term of mortgage that we defined as conventional above within those 5 days. If the buyer doesn't do that within 5 days, the buyer is defaulting. It's going to be hard for you to go back and exercise this financing contingency if the buyer did not apply within a timely manner. Even going past that, past the initial application, as we all know, there are lots of documents that are required from the buyer after the loan application. You may get a loan approval with 500 conditions on it. The only condition that matters is the sale of a prior property. What do you mean the sale of a prior property? But we didn't do a contingency on this contract for the sale of their prior home. That's correct. But someone's loan approval might be contingent on them selling a prior asset. So a loan approval is a loan approval, regardless of the list of conditions attached to it, as long as one of the conditions is not to sell a prior asset. If you provide a loan approval that requires the sale of a prior home to be completed, it is not considered a loan approval. Okay? What I like is in 2017, the Florida Realtors added a clause in here, which is lines 99 to 102, which is an authorization from the buyer and the seller, allowing the mortgage broker, the title company, the lender, everybody to communicate with all parties regarding the status. Have you ever called the lender to find out the status of another buyer's loan and they just wouldn't talk to you? You can cite these lines in the contract. Hey, I have authorization. You got to talk to me. What's going on? And if they don't, guess what? Causing issues. That's definitely a red flag. Okay? These are all clauses talking about what we just went over, the 3 days of the seller's ability to cancel, and what happens with the deposit if that happens. So let's go talk here about line 116, section 7 of the financing contingency. If the loan approval was obtained or the contingency has been waived and the buyer fails to close, the seller has a right to make a claim on the deposit unless one of three things happens. Number one, the seller defaults on the contract or refuses to close. Buyer would get their deposit back. Number two, property-related conditions of the loan approval. Property-related conditions of the loan approval, what could that be? Property-related conditions of the loan approval. Could be clear codes, could be cleared of liens, could be any cloud on the title that prohibits closing. There's really not much else that can go there. They could be conditions of the appraisal, for example. You all know there's two types of appraisals. There's an as-is appraisal and a subject-to appraisal. The as-is appraisal means the property in its current condition is worth X amount. The subject-to appraisal means the property is worth X amount after these things are done. In which case, sure, it's being recorded though. Okay. The subject-to appraisal means the value is X subject to XYZ being done. So that would require those XYZ items to be completed prior to the appraisal being validated. Okay.
Would insurance not being provided by the condo association? Adequate insurance?
Insurance not being provided by the condo association, would that be a property-related condition? That's a great question. I don't know. I don't know. I think that would be falling under a different clause of the contract. If it's a condominium, that would fall more under the condo rider and the terms supplied in there. For this section, I don't believe that would apply, but there is a separate out if the condo doesn't provide terms for the loan. However, the loan would be denied before you get to that point. Right. Okay, so going along those lines, you're saying so the lender did not want to provide a clear to close or a loan approval until the condo association provided certain insurance documents. So this is important information for you to know, because when you get to that end of that 30 days, if the loan hasn't been approved, you need to do something and take action to protect your buyer, or at least put the ball in their court and give them the option to make a decision. So let's say you're on day 29. Let's say you're on day 30, okay? And the loan hasn't been approved. You know that there are conditions there that could be a little bit sticky. You have a few different options. You can either A, cancel and get out to protect the buyer's escrow. B, you could extend the financing contingency through an extension addendum. Or C, you could simply just waive the loan approval and not give the seller those 3 days. But be very careful when you do that. You need to make sure the buyer is going to close. You need to make sure that it's just merely a formality. We don't want the seller to cancel on us. Okay. So in my opinion, I'd be extending the loan approval period at that time. Mm-hmm. Oh, I see that all the time. So that's when an extension addendum is done, but they simply extend the closing date, not really thinking about the loan approval. See that all the time. Thinking that the old financing contingency, the way that that used to work, was the financing contingency would live on past the 30 days until either a loan approval was provided or 7 days prior to closing. I'm very happy that they took that out of the contract because it was very confusing, and I've gone toe-to-toe with a few brokers about it over the years, but it's much clearer with the terms that they've included now. So that doesn't really happen very much anymore. Correct. Correct. By extending the closing date, not the financing contingency. The financing contingency is gone and they must close. You're just giving them more time to close. I don't even want to broach the subject if E&O covers that, because let's just not do it. Would it cover that? Possibly. Possibly. To know that for a fact, I'd have to call the insurance guys, but if you made a mistake and extended the closing date but not the financing period and they lost money, would that cover? Possible. That's a great question. So we talked about reason 1 and 2 that the buyer could get their deposit back if they failed to close after loan approval. The third one would be, and this is unique, it wasn't built into here before, but the appraisal for the property obtained by buyer's lender is insufficient to meet terms of the loan approval, meaning it underappraised. That's very interesting that they included that in here. But you've got to think, what is their loan to value? So in this case, we did a $400,000 mortgage, 20% down. If the appraisal came in and it was not satisfactory enough that I'd have to put more money down, that is not the terms of my loan approval. What I mean by that is, okay, we got a loan approval, but there will be a condition if appraisal was not done of a satisfactory appraisal. The satisfactory appraisal coming in, according to my terms of my loan approval, would be 20% down or a $400,000 mortgage. So it would need a $500,000 valuation. Let's say it came in at 480, okay? My loan to value loan approval was 20%. So the bank will now only give me, I'm getting complicated with numbers now. The bank will now only give me a portion of that, and I'd be required to put more money down for this deal to close. That is not satisfactory to my loan approval, meaning that would be an out of the contract for me. Let's say it overappraised. Great. That's always lovely when that happens. But given that circumstance, you're looking at that point for a $500,000 appraisal or higher. Yes.
If the appraisal, and we're going to probably see this more and more often,
Mm-hmm.
changes, appraisals like low.
Right. No, there's still ways to close even if you don't put more money down. Yes, they can, depending. So the question was, if it underappraises, the buyer can't now say that they just don't want the property, even if the lender is willing to close with it, right? So not necessarily, it depends. If they were provided a loan approval already, okay, the terms on the loan approval will be established. It will say $400,000 loan amount, 80-20 loan to value. 80-20 loan to value, okay? If it doesn't come in at that specific structure, yes, it is an out for the buyer. Now, let's go back a little bit more. Let's say we didn't get the loan approval and the appraisal comes in under. I'm still within my time frame to terminate for the loan, the financing contingency. So as a buyer's representative, when I get a loan approval from a lender, I want to limit those conditions as much as possible, and I want the appraisal to be done way ahead of time. Personally, I like the appraisal to be done within the first 15 days, but I'm using AMP where they're paying for the appraisal. It's not my buyer's expense. If it's my buyer's expense, I'm waiting till after inspection to make sure, yeah, it's in good condition, we're going to proceed. Now we'll pay for the appraisal, because those are hard costs the buyer can't get back. You had a question? It's always great when it overpraises. No. So great question. If it overappraises, can the seller cancel? The answer is no, they cannot. Unless you don't provide them a loan approval and they're within that 3 days. It would be a great idea for them to cancel because they're leaving money on the table. But they may be in the mindset of a bird in the hand is better, So they may just take it as it is and write it off as not having it. I've even seen listing agents not tell the seller that it overappraised in fear of what they'll do. That's not a good practice either. We're here to represent everybody's best interest, right? Okay, questions about the financing contingency? You're not obligated to. The way that I put that to a seller, if I know it came in over, the appraisal was satisfactory. That's it. Don't want to talk numbers. Unless you're really, you got a big ego and you were spot on with what you thought it would be and what you told them, It's not necessary to tell them unless it underappraises. Otherwise, it's satisfactory. It got great news. The appraisal came back and we're good to proceed. That's it. Short and sweet. Okay. Moving down, closing cost section. Okay. Trying to get to the additional terms. That's going to be the fun part. Okay. Closing costs. This part of the contract outlines what the responsibilities are for closing for both the seller and the buyer, obviously broken down into individual sections. These are actually the sections that the title companies who are handling your closing go by as far as fees go. I do want to point out 2 blank lines in this section that nobody ever looks at. Under the cost to be paid by seller, this little other line on the right side, sometimes an agent will put in there a credit from the seller to the buyer, and you're not going to see it. You need to review this section. That is the sneakiest spot that somebody will put a seller concession into. And guess what? Whether you see it or not, if it's in there in the contract, it was agreed upon, and that will cause a conflict. Again, you've got to read your contract before you provide it to the seller, okay? Same thing, these are also sections where you can place a type of transaction fee or a processing fee if you are charging one to your customer. It can go into the additional terms at the end. It's the easiest place to put it, but sometimes it is put into these sections. So make sure you're looking at those when you're reviewing a contract before providing it to your seller, or vice versa from the seller to the buyer, okay? All of the lines in these sections are defined as to who pays them based on this section below that we're about to go over, and that will determine things. As you'll see, owner's policy and charges, if paragraph 9C1 is checked. We're going to go over that below, and then we'll come back to it. So here's that section below, 9C1, 2, and on the next page is 3, the Miami-Dade Broward Regional Provision. These are the 3 options, and one of these must be selected. What these are defining are who is picking the title company handling the closing and who is responsible for what fees. The easiest way for me to describe this is between the 3 sections. Seller shall designate closing agent. When the seller designates the closing agent, they pay the majority of the costs. Buyer designates closing agent. When the buyer designates, the buyer pays the majority of the costs. Going down to section 3 here, it says Miami-Dade Broward Regional Provision, but that doesn't mean that you can only use it if you're in Miami-Dade or Broward County. You can use this anywhere in Florida. It's just called that because of the commonality in Miami-Dade and Broward for the exchange in fees. So you can use that anywhere. And the reason I like that one is there are shared expenses on both sides of the table. It is more of a balance of the fees. It's not a 50-50 split, but we'll go up top and we'll review that. So remember, 1 is seller, where seller pays, 2 is buyer, where buyer pays, and 3 is somewhat split. And you'll notice that in this section of the fees to be paid by both sides, what belongs to what? What can really change? So we'll start at the top. Doc stamps are always on the seller. Owner's policy and charges. Owner's policy and charges. What does that mean? It's kind of open. You'd think it's the owner's title policy, right? But it's more than that. That is a defined term. If you notice, the first letter of each word is capitalized, meaning it is a legal defined term in the contract. Let's figure out what that is. Scroll down to our sections here. Here is our definition. Quote, owner's policy and charges. So that is the owner's title policy premium, title search, and closing services. All of those are looped into owner's policy and charges. So that means settlement fees, title insurance premium, and the actual title search or abstract itself. So think about that. Let's say you close with the in-house title company, okay? They're a flat $495 across the board. It's an easy number to decide. So here, if you pick number 1, the seller shall designate, that means the seller is paying for all settlement fees, all title charges, all title searches and abstracts. That could total up to an extra $1,200. $495 times 2 plus $185 for a title search or an abstract plus the title policy. Yes. Correct. You can raise that point. So the question is, even when it's seller select, you'll see $495 on both sides. You can simply say, incorrect, that goes on the seller side. Point out this part of the contract. This is all part of negotiation, okay? So typically you'll see in the Tri-County area here in South Florida, in Miami-Dade and Broward, typically the buyer will choose. That's not the law. Everything is up for negotiation. In Palm Beach, you'll typically see the seller choose. That's not the law. It's just commonly done. It's all up for negotiation. If I'm on the buyer side, I want the seller to pick because it's going to save my buyer some money, unless there's some conflict in the relationship there. If I'm in Palm Beach, I want the buyer to select Because the big chunk right there is that title policy. That could save your customer thousands of dollars. And depending on if they're buying FHA or if they're, you know, scraping things together in order to get this purchase, that could make a big difference for them on closing. A really big difference. Yes.
I've had an agent pick the title, but the buyer wanted the house.
You've had an agent select, seller selects, for example, but then the buyer paid for everything?
Yeah, like they want to choose the title and what they pay.
So everything's up for negotiation. You can still have, for example, you can check this box right here, but then in additional terms, right, buyer was responsible for all title charges, owner's policy and charges. You can modify things like that. Or you can have buyer selects, but then the seller will tell them, okay, do this one, but we're going to tell you which title company to pick.
They have to pay, right?
Depends on what you select in the contract.
I normally select the Miami-Dade. But
I do as well. Miami-Dade Broward is the way to go.
But you have some agents that the seller has like must use seller's title.
Okay.
And then they still don't pay.
If it says must use seller's title company, I check seller shall designate. Period. It's on you and what you're negotiating and the terms you're putting into the contract.
So you're saying, clarify the third question.
Mhm.
Sellers saying, I want to choose a title company. I don't want the buyer to pay the closing.
It's all part of the negotiation.
Just make sure you put that clearly.
Yes.
Sellers choosing title company, the buyer's probably closing company.
Correct. Or you select the buyer or the Miami-Dade Broward Regional, and then in the additional terms, title company will be indicated by seller. So the charges are listed in the contract that the buyer's paying them, but the seller is giving them the company to pick. Does that make sense?
Now, 90% of the time, you're seeing that quote that's supposed to be on both sides. And if you're saying, let's say buyer shall designate closing.
It's all supposed to go on the buyer side. If buyer is selecting, it's all supposed to go on the seller side if the seller is designating. To be honest with you, most title companies don't even understand that. It's on us to know it. And then they're gonna, yes. So yes, it is on you to define that and be aware of what's happening. And sometimes educating the title companies, sometimes. Our title company knows this now. Because I go over that with them all the time. When they bring it up to me, hey, why are they pushing it to this side? Here, this is why. Here are the terms of the contract. This is what we have to go by. But many title companies just go through the motions. They're just running through, they're processing deals. And this stuff has all changed over the years. They might still be doing it like how it was done 25 years ago when that wasn't the case. But now all these terms are defined as part of the contract, okay? I've left this one section on the screen here and we kind of skipped over it for a second, but we're gonna go back. Right here, line 145 to 156. This is kind of a hidden out of the contract that nobody ever pays attention to. Title evidence and insurance. At least X amount of time before closing date, a title insurance commitment issued by a title insurer will be provided and delivered to buyer. So this is an obligation from seller to buyer to provide clear title insurance commitment. Does the seller ever have anything to do with securing a title commitment? Title company does it. Does the seller ever really get notified or get a copy of that? Does the buyer ever get a copy of that? Hardly ever. You got to pay attention to this. This is a very common out that a buyer's representative attorney will use to get out of a contract if you've reached an impasse and the buyer has no other out. Say, well, you didn't provide us with a title commitment within 15 days. What do you mean? What are you talking about? I don't have to give you a title commitment. You do. The seller needs to provide a title commitment from them to the buyer, saying essentially, there's clear title as long as XYZ is completed. It's something that you've probably never heard, something you've probably never come in contact with, but I've seen maybe a handful of escrow disputes be resolved because of this contract clause right there.
Do you want to keep it at 15 or make it 10 or 15?
15's fine. It doesn't really matter. Title companies will get that back within a couple days. But it's on you to really ask for that. If you're on the buyer side, quiet, don't say anything. because it's a potential out for your buyer. Okay. If you're on the seller side, you want to follow up and hound the title company. Did you provide a title commitment? Give me the title commitment. Did you send it to the buyer? As a practice, our in-house one now sends notification to both sides that they've received the title commitment. And if you need a copy of it, let them know. That is now, no. A clear commitment has been issued. Correct. That's part of our automated system. As soon as it comes back from the underwriter, you get an auto notification. So that part of the contract is alleviated with our title company. Most people don't pay attention to that section, okay? So that is a really common out that you will see in the event that you've hit an escrow dispute. And it's ridiculous in my opinion, but it is what it is, okay? One of these three, correct. Selecting title, one of these three must be selected. Okay.
I want to net 300,000. So they're basically saying, I don't care what the cost, we should just get 300,000 we get a deal. Then we approach the three check.
When you're talking about a net number that the seller wants, it's a good idea to provide a seller net sheet explaining the three different ones, maybe even outlining the three different options and what the net proceeds are in the end. Because that seller that wants a net 300,000 probably doesn't care who closes it. And it's about balancing the funds to get them the max amount of money, right? Would that seller who wants 300,000 be ecstatic if you got him 302? Probably. So you want to negotiate the terms of your contract as much in their favor as humanly possible. If it's a seller, you want to try and get the buyer to select buyer designates, because that shifts so many of the closing costs over to the buyer. It depends. It depends. My recommendation on which one you select depends on your circumstances. If I'm repping the seller and I want to make sure I'm maximizing their money, I'm selecting the second one, buyer designates closing agent, because the majority of expenses are passed to the buyer. If I'm the buyer and I'm trying to decrease their expenses, I want to do seller. The most reasonable and fair, in my opinion, is the last one, the Miami-Dade Broward Regional. But if I'm really trying to work my side to get them the most, I'm picking either buyer or seller. A savvy agent knows the difference, though. You can't put in additional terms, seller will net 300,000. How does that govern anything? How does that govern anything? What if your contract's at 304 and you have the terms of the contract and then you get to the end and their seller will net 300,000? How does that govern? If that doesn't happen, who's in default? That's not an appropriate term to put in the contract. There's no way for that to happen. If you're putting in the additional term, seller will net 300,000 with the expectation that brokers are going to decrease their commissions in order to make that 300,000, brokers aren't party to this. This contract has two parties, buyer and seller. You cannot obligate anything from a broker inside of this contract.
So to clarify this, then would you put 300 net on the first page where you're putting the numbers in?
No.
If it's a cash deal.
Nope. I would not put anything about net numbers on here. Nothing. I'm simply outlining the terms in here to get the seller to their net number. So I will take the terms of this contract, provide them a seller net sheet to show them what their bottom line is according to the terms of this contract. You know how to do seller net sheets? Great question. We do have seller net sheets that are auto-populated. You can go to the closing team's website, closingteamfl.com. Bottom right corner, there is a widget where you can pop in seller net sheets. It auto-populates title insurance costs, tax stamps, doc stamps, transfer taxes, settlement fees, all that stuff populates in there and gives you open fields to put in commissions, transaction fees, transfer fees from association, estoppels, anything. Prorating taxes also goes in there. You can put everything in there. And it puts together a really nice single page format for you to send to the seller, and saves it in case you want to modify it later. For example, I want to do 3 of them based on different styles of terms that we can negotiate. Okay, if we accept at 485, it'll be this. If we accept at 495, it'll be this. If we accept at 505, it'll be this. It's actually a very effective way for you to put in perspective to the seller when you have a unique circumstance. For example, I assisted one of my teachers from high school in selling her home in Boca a couple months ago, and the buyer was a licensee. She said, I'll waive my commission for this price. So I said, okay, here's a net sheet at this price with no commission to the buyer's agent. Here is a net sheet at $10,000 more, but you have to pay the 3% commission to the buyer's agent. She actually made more by dropping the price $10,000 and taking the lower one with that waived commission. It was a $13,000 commission, something along those lines. So she ended up saving a few $1,000s by taking that one. It allows us to put into perspective what the terms are and how those unique circumstances fit into what their bottom line really means. While we're in the industry, we can kind of understand that. Someone from outside, they only transact once or twice or 3 times in their life. So it's very hard for them to conceptually understand that. Closingteamfl.com, correct. Or you go to our website and click Closing Team, and it'll take you there automatically. Yeah. At the time of doing the listing presentation, would I advise doing that? Possibly. Possibly. I have a bit of a different tactic when it comes to listing presentations. I don't have this big, long presentation put together. I'm more relying on the relationship that I build with them and the confidence that I hope they instill in me to get the listing, as opposed to a fancy listing presentation. But what was that? Class on listing presentations. We will. I've got some unique stuff coming up about listing presentations and iBuyers. So look out for that coming up on the calendar in the next couple months. We've got a lot coming up. But let's continue. Let's get back on track here. So survey. Nothing really to take care of in here except for understanding. The buyer has the ability at their own expense to secure a survey. That's typically done through the title company. I know it's an automated request from our title company. Do you want a survey or not? Sometimes it is a requirement for the lender. Sometimes it is not. If the seller does have a survey, they're supposed to give you a copy of it within 5 days of effective date. Does that ever happen? Not necessarily, but then again, you don't know if they have one or not. Okay. Home warranty. This is not an obligatory section. You can leave this blank. However, if you are including warranty or any type of credit toward the home warranty, this is a section that it would go in. What you will see occasionally is on foreclosure properties through Freddie Mac. There is a certain allowance permitted for a home warranty to be purchased because they want the buyer to feel, yes, it's foreclosure, but everything's okay in the house. We'll pay up to $350 for a home warranty. So in this section, you would place at closing, seller to pay for home warranty for $350. Excuse me. Put that in the wrong section. That would go into that section, and the name of the company they're securing the warranty from would go here, or it is valid for you to put TBD in this section because they're not sure who they're going to be doing a home warranty through. That's like American Home Shield, the Service America, those kind of companies. I don't see this very frequently anymore, so I'm not very concerned with this section. I believe in a future revision of the contract, this will actually be removed because it is not really used. Trying to keep the terms of the contract as simple as possible. You can leave it blank. You can pass through if it doesn't apply, or you can select that NA box. Most attorneys will tell you don't leave anything blank. So you can select NA there. Okay, not applicable. This next section is a good one. Yes, go ahead. It's a good point. That's a very good point. It doesn't have realtor as an option. Yeah. I remember that. So in that case, actually, you can have, if you are, as the realtor, paying for a home warranty, you can select in here buyer and then provide a credit to the buyer. So essentially the buyer is paying for it, but you're giving them the money back, right? So this next section, special assessments, like this section, very commonly mistaken section. Let's just read the first line. At closing, seller shall pay, 1, the full amount of liens imposed by a public body, and they made it stupid proof, does not include a condominium or homeowners association. This is so frequently thought of as condo assessments. It is not the case. These special assessments are the bottom section of the property tax bill, or non-ad valorem taxes, like trash, sewer, sidewalk improvements, things like that. This is a really, really important section, especially in today's day and age. What else can fall under special assessments on their tax bill? Fire department, fire rescue, that's another one. Okay, but that's $350. I'm looking for something bigger than that. What's another special assessment that can go on their property tax bill in that non-ad valorem section? Exactly. Have you heard of Y Green? Y Green or the PACE program? Those are energy efficient home improvements which get placed onto your property tax record as non-ad valorem assessments. It's essentially a loan tied to the property, tied to the equity in the property that has to get paid. These are special assessments. So technically, if that first box is checked or neither is checked, the buyer is assuming responsibility of that non-ad valorem assessment, which could be $20,000. Woo boy. So as a default, I'm always checking that section, that second box. I want to make sure that if there is anything, any type of assessment, any type of liability that the prior owner has obligated themselves to, that they take care of it at closing and hand it off at zero. That is a really, really important section. Really important. I saw someone get burned for $17,000. It was a Y Green improvement at the very beginning of Y Green. And it was included as a non-ad valorem assessment, and when transferred over, it transfers over with the property. They should be, and hopefully they realize that before the end of the loan approval period so they can get out and resolve that, but that's another way your deal could die. So I'd rather have the knowledge ahead of time and check things and make sure that I am covered ahead of time. Does that make sense? This is all public record. You can pull this up. Go to the property appraiser, pull up the tax bill, and look at the bottom. It will be very abundantly clear. You'll see, oh my God, that's a big number. Most of the assessments, 5, 35, 350 at the maximum. But those large ones are definitely concerning, and that's when this really applies. If you don't check anything, it defaults to A. Yep. Yep, exactly. My next door neighbor did one. $12,000 on a non-ad valorem assessment. And if he sells, doesn't check that, the buyer is going to assume responsibility. Got to check that second box to protect your buyer. Okay. Next, we've got some common disclosures: radon gas, permits, mold, flood zones, elevation. None of this stuff will really affect your transaction. You know, it's a seller's obligation to disclose work that was done without permits. It's a seller's obligation to disclose any knowledge of radon gas, of mold. None of this stuff will really affect your transaction. And of course, there's nothing you can change in there either. Lead-based paint, same thing. Homeowners Association disclosure. I like this one. Okay, it's in bold for a reason. HOA and community disclosure. The buyer should not execute this contract until they've received and read the HOA community disclosure if applicable. What is the HOA or community disclosure? Nope. Not the bylaws, not the rules and regulations, not the covenants. HOA only, not condo. This says homeowners or community. So it's not condo. It's actually simply the homeowners association rider to the contract. If you look at the top of that rider, it defines itself as homeowners association / community disclosure rider. And it says this must accompany your contract, pretty much. This must be signed prior to the contract. It's because homeowners association rules and regulations are public records. So the buyer is advised to review those ahead of time because their acceptance and review of that stuff is not subject to the contract. By buying or agreeing to enter into purchase the contract, they're already saying we've reviewed it, we're good. A condo is very different. Those are not publicly recorded. So you have to get those and you have time to review those. HOAs are different. Understand the difference between condo and HOA.
There's no documentation from the homeowner association
That is correct. There is no requirement of documentation from the seller to the buyer regarding rules, covenants, restrictions, even if an approval is required. That is correct. Only for condos. Yep. Okay. So understand that kind of stuff. On a condo, they have the time to get all that information, then 3 days to review it at their own discretion. HOAs, that is not the case. For the HOA, no, they're not going to have them. They're going to say, go look them up. So even if you ask for them, they might have them, but most often they do not. And they don't really care because it's not an obligation.
You know, you see more HOAs like Margate,
Mm-hmm.
where they're charging $200 or $300 a month. There's a simple HOA.
Correct.
And yet they're not required to write any documentation about maintenance, assessments.
What they are required to disclose is what's on that homeowners association rider, which are assessments and monthly fees. That stuff is on there. The financial aspect is on there. The rules and covenants and restrictions, that is not. That is all public record. You can go look up the name of the association and pull that document online from the county clerk of courts. That's all public records. Okay, moving down. Property inspection, right to cancel. Notice this doesn't say right to repair. It's right to inspect. Okay, it's very important that you squash the misconception of your buyer that when you do your inspection, you can require the seller to repair everything that's on the inspection report. Explain to them what the purpose of the home inspection is. We're buying the house as it is right now. We have this time to review and inspect the property with as many people as we want during this time period. We could bring our cousin Joe, if Joe likes plumbing, and have Joe inspect it. We don't have to have a licensed and insured contractor and inspector. It's a great idea to do that, but if the buyer wants their cousin Joe to walk through and look at the place, guess what? He can bring cousin Joe to walk through the place. It's completely their right. They can go as many times as they want with whomever they want during the inspection period. It is the seller's obligation to provide access. I just had a very fun scenario come up on a $1.2 million property in Fort Lauderdale, where the buyer did their home inspection on day 3, 10-day inspection period, and some issues with the impact windows came up. So they said, we'd like to have a window person come back and give us an opinion what needs to be done with the windows. Seller said, no, you can't come. We're going out of town, you can't come. We're not extending your inspection period. Let us know what you want to do. What are you going to do? Well, essentially, we obligated them to extend the inspection period so that we had time for them to come back from out of town and inspect that. Turns into an $83,000 repair on the windows, but regardless, that is the buyer's right to go in with as many people as they want, whenever they want during that time period to confirm the condition of the home. So going back, I really recommend you explain this to your buyers as part of the offer when you are writing it. Now we have 10 days. Now we have 14 days. Now we have 15 days to inspect the property and confirm the condition. What we're looking for are major defects, major expenses that you might incur as part of your purchase or when you move into the home. Is the roof need to be replaced right away? Is the air conditioner about to break? Are there foundation issues? Things like that. Okay, mold, things like that. Don't say mold. It's like saying bomb on an airplane. You don't say mold in a house.
So the seller has to provide access, obviously. But if they don't, then the buyer has to cancel.
If the seller doesn't provide access, the buyer really doesn't have very many remedies. They can decide to proceed or they can decide to cancel. In this case, we had to get an attorney involved and essentially threaten them for liquidated damages, for damages incurred as part of the process for them not holding up their end of the bargain. Mm-hmm. The seller can be uncooperative, yes, but if buyer is motivated enough and the realtor is hungry enough, they can push it along, and yeah, it's not a fun circumstance to be in, I'll tell you that.
And it has to provide access. If this property is vacant,
Mm-hmm.
the utilities are not on, water's not on, power's not on, they got to provide utilities.
So the question was, if there's no power or utilities on in the property, do they have to provide that? No. You can inspect the property as it is where it is.
The buyer would have to turn the water on.
Does the buyer have the right to turn on utilities? Can you silence that? Oh, it's her back there. Does the buyer have the right to turn them on? Depends on the utility provider. It's very difficult to do. Very difficult. I have seen realtors turn it on, actually.
They wouldn't give yourself permission to do that.
Yes.
They wouldn't say, we're going to turn the water on. They want to check to do this stuff.
Yeah. The electric is not that hard to do. I mean, you can call like you're setting up a new account, but somebody's got to do it. And does the buyer want to do it? No. Do you want to do that? Probably not.
You want the liability.
Exactly.
On it, it floods the apartment.
What happens if you turn on the power, there's a short and the house catches on fire? It's really inspect as is where is.
Yeah, you have to get the seller to sign something.
Correct.
Liability.
Correct. Waiving of liability, something like that. I would really just advise to inspect as is where is in the current condition that it's in. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we talked about the inspection period. Let's continue talking about that. Let's say we have the default 15-day inspection period. We've done our inspection on day 10. We got our report back on day 11. We discuss it with our buyers on day 11. What are the major issues? Okay, there's a roof issue. Great, sounds good. Let's get that resolved. It is not really within our rights of the contract to say, we want X credit or we want the seller to repair the roof. That's not really within our rights of the contract. And simply notifying them that there's an issue with the roof doesn't really do anything. We have to come to an agreement with them during this time period. So as I mentioned, day 11, we've discussed with our buyers, we know what they want. We sent an email to the listing agent saying, hey, there's a big issue with the roof. We're gonna have some insurance problems, XYZ, yada, yada, yada. However, my buyer's okay to close if you give them a $2,500 credit at closing so they can fix it after the fact. Listing agent doesn't respond. Why aren't they answering me? Day 13 comes along, still no answer. Day 14 comes along, still no answer. We're now on day 15. We made a request for a $2,500 credit, but the listing agent hasn't responded. They do not have an obligation to respond. It's important for you to understand your timeline. If you're on day 15 and they haven't responded, it's time to have a good conversation with your buyer and say they haven't responded. If they don't respond, do you still want the house? If they do, my recommendation would be to do two things. Number one, actually two things inside of one email. It would be completing both an extension of the inspection period, as well, actually three things. Extension of the inspection period, an addendum to the contract with the $2,500 credit, and a release and cancellation. I would provide all three of those attachments in one email to the listing agent saying, I've previously contacted you, $2,500 credit for the roof. I haven't heard back from you. Please take this as formal notice of the following. Have your seller select one of these options or consider this formal cancellation. The seller may sign A, which is the extension addendum, allowing them to continue to have a conversation and a dialogue with you to come to an agreement. B would be the addendum crediting the money from the seller to the buyer and you can move forward. Or C would be the release and cancellation, protecting your buyer's escrow. So it's very common, you'll see the addendum for credit and a cancellation if you're at the last hour to really just satisfy as your notice of termination if they don't sign that. If you don't return this back to us by midnight tonight, please consider this our formal cancellation. You're protecting your buyer's escrow. That's the whole point. You need to understand your timelines. Simply notifying the seller ahead of time does not give you any rights. You have your inspection period to cancel. That's it. Not to negotiate terms.
You're negotiating like issues during the inspection period. They have a 10-day inspection period. You guys negotiate issues. You go past 10 days. You're already in negotiation during the 10 days.
Nope. So the question is, if you're negotiating with the seller during the inspection period, but then the inspection period lapses and they don't sign anything, it's as if you didn't talk to them at all. You must take action before the end of the inspection period. Something has to happen. So whether it's signing the addendum, coming to an agreement, extending the inspection period to continue conversations, or canceling outright. If you don't do anything, it's as if nothing ever happened. There was a case that settled about 2 years ago now It was for a $3 million house in Miami, something like that, 3-4 million. And they did the inspection. It was a 15-day inspection period. They got the inspection back on day 13 and notified the seller of like $87,000 in repairs, something like that. It was mold everywhere. Stuff had to be repaired. It was disastrous, right? Buyer's agent notified the listing agent of XYZ repairs that had to be done and waited. Listing agent never responded. That was it. No response to communication. Went all the way through. Seller shows up at closing, says, where are you guys? Buyers aren't there for closing. Buyer said, we notified you of some issues with the inspection. Seller said, you didn't cancel. You didn't cancel. Well, the listing agent was there too. You didn't. They did not send a cancellation. They simply requested repairs to be done. That was it. They sent an addendum for repairs to be done, which was not signed by the seller, was not canceled during the inspection period, was merely notified. This was in litigation for 3 years. In the end, it was like $600,000 in attorney's fees as well. So in the end, the seller won and was able to retain the $300,000 escrow deposit, as well as recovering all of their legal expenses as part of the case. That agent made a big boo-boo. You must cancel or modify during the inspection period. Notifying them is not sufficient. Question was, you did say that the inspection period ends at midnight of the 15th day. Yes, that is correct. It ends at midnight, 11:59:59 of the last day of the inspection period, unless the inspection period ends on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. So let's say today was our effective date and we have a 10-day. I've got Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Next Sunday would be the end of my inspection period. However, it can't end on a Sunday, so that would pass on to Monday at 5 p.m. Let's say the 10 days ended on a Tuesday. It would be Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. and 59 seconds. It all has to do with your timestamp on your email that you send over any type of notice of cancellation. If it has to go to the following business day, it's 5 p.m. Correct. And that is defined under a time clause in the contract here. After, correct. If the term ends on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, it becomes 5 p.m. the following business day. It could be Monday, but if it's this weekend, it'd be Tuesday. It's Labor Day. Okay. Now it's not holidays like, come up with a random one. Flag Day. Flag Day is not a recognized U.S. legal holiday. Correct. Correct. And there is actually a definition of legal holidays as we get through the contract. I'll point that out later. There is a definition of legal holidays and where to reference the actual holidays that are used. So it's not whether you or I consider something a holiday or not. It is defined inside the contract. So we'll get there. Right. Cinco de Mayo is a big holiday for me. It's officially a big holiday for me. Okay. So walk through an inspection and reinspection. On the day prior to the closing date or on the closing date prior to closing specified by the buyer or buyer's representative may complete a walkthrough of the property to confirm that everything was done. It's the buyer's right to walk through and make sure the sellers maintain the property. No ifs, ands, or buts. The seller is required to leave the property in quote unquote broom swept condition. Meaning all of their items have been removed and they swept it out. Doesn't have to be spick and span, doesn't have to be Molly made perfect. It has to be broom swept. Okay? If you do have an issue come up at the pre-closing walkthrough, you need to resolve it right away. For example, you had washer, dryer, and microwave included on that first page of the contract, but you get to the home and the washer and dryer are gone. You need to resolve it right there. Period. How do you resolve that? Great question. So there's a few different ways. Number one would be seller, you took the washer dryer, they need to come back. Have them bring them back. Number two would be instead of bringing it back, you can provide us a credit, we'll go buy a comparable one. Those are alternatives. Otherwise, it's the seller's default, not the buyer's. I know where you're going. The only way, so is if you have like a really nice Samsung front loader during inspection and walkthrough, and they take it out and they put in a ding and dent whirlpool that makes a really loud squelch, squealing, whatever, screeching when it turns on. Scratch, 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 scratch. How can you alleviate that? So that's just like maintaining the property condition. Let's say you go into a room and it's painted white and there's pictures on the wall. When they take the pictures off the wall, if they leave big gaping holes in it, it's a similar circumstance. It's maintaining the property in certain condition. So it should be of equal level or comparable. The only way to 100% alleviate that concern from ever happening is to attach the MLS pictures or the make and model of the appliances in the personal property condition. You could just say washer and dryer as seen during showing.
Right.
You could say that as well. That would work. But then how do you prove what was there during showing?
Right.
You could say washer and dryer as seen on MLS, something like that. Some type of reference that takes you back there. Otherwise, they're required to leave a washer dryer.
Right.
You won't typically see someone go through all of that over a silly washer dryer, but it's possible. It's possible. You'll more often see where they take the washer dryer because you didn't include it in the contract. That is a much more common occurrence than they took it out and put another one in. Yeah. Okay. Line 268, seller assistance. Oh my God, we're only on page 5. Seller assistance and cooperation in closeout of building permits. So this obligates the seller to cooperate with the buyer closing out permits. The seller doesn't have to pay for anything. They simply have to cooperate, meaning signing or providing documentation that they might have had from the past. That's a big issue. Now, there has been some legislation passed recently that automatically sunsets some old open permits. I believe it's 7 years old. Cities can eliminate open or expired permits from the record so that they are gone and not really an issue. You know, the days of the 1992 open permit causing you a closing issue are gone. And that goes into effect in October, actually. So that will be really nice to see how it affects things. But with this being said, building permits, code violations, liens, compliance notices, all of that kind of stuff could be a very offsetting and unpleasing occurrence for your buyers. So there are some clauses that we recommend you put into the additional terms, which I will scroll down and show you right now. If we go down to additional terms, it is. We go to additional terms. If you're on Form Simplicity or Transaction Desk, there are default clauses put in there by us for you. You could simply drop down, pick permits, and hit insert clause. It will automatically include that term into the end of the contract for you. This is the most simplified version of the terms that I would recommend. Seller agrees to close out any open or expired permits, code violations, and or liens prior to closing at his or her own expense, if applicable. That's it. If there's anything that comes up, code violations, open or expired permits, and or liens, the seller has to close them out at their own expense. That is my recommended clause to make sure that you don't have those kinds of issues regarding permits. Any questions about that? Sure. It's on your Form Simplicity, though. Yeah, whenever you're writing a contract, look at the top. There are some default clauses in there. You have to put it in, but the terminology is already in there at the top here. See the section at the top says insert clause. You can drop down. Right now I have 2 in there. There's one for an escalation clause, which we'll talk about later, and there's one for permits, and you can just hit insert clause and it goes into the bottom.
We had a situation where it said, since you're open expired, needed or required.
Needed or required?
Because it did some work without permits.
Right. Not necessarily. So I put open and expired permits, code violations, and or liens. It's considered a code violation when they put a required. That is a code violation. That will come back on the lien search from the city. If they are given a notice from the city, that's a code violation.
That's why they put additional language, any needed or required permits.
I don't really agree with that. So as part of the seller's disclosure, the seller is required to tell you of any work that was done without permits. If they put in a hot water heater without permits and the city doesn't know about it, it's never going to come back to you.
So we had a buyer.
Mhm.
Their attorney said, we're gonna put in, and there was additional language to this.
Right?
The seller didn't want to sign it because liability in that.
It's an open liability. It's open.
Yeah. So the seller did not want to sign it, and almost, we got the, finally got it resolved.
Right.
But almost fixed it.
Yeah, you can put too much in there that it is concerning to the other side. I mean, if you put in a clause in there that said seller agrees to provide any permits that might be needed or required, that's really open-ended, super open-ended. This one's very direct. If you have an open expired permit, a code violation, or a lien, seller's going to close it. That's it. You're supposed to get a permit for a water heater. Anytime you touch or move water or electric or walls, structural, you also need permits. Does everybody pull permits for all that stuff? This is being recorded, so I'm going to say maybe.
Even a simple one window, you can put one window in.
Correct. You need a permit for window. That is absolutely correct. Where am I going? All right, we're back up here. We are back at the permits. Okay, moving on. Escrow agent, section 13, line 281. This reflects handling of the escrow deposits and collectible and collection funds. I'm going to leave that alone as it's really not going to impact your transaction. There's nothing you can change in there, and there are no obligations on either side. It's more about the closing agent's responsibility. Professional advice. This is a disclosure to protect you, the agent, and us as the broker about liabilities. We're essentially recommending that they get inspections done and consult legal advice. Don't take our word for it. Don't take the seller's word for it. Verify everything. But there are no requirements in this section as far as something the buyer, seller, or brokers need to do. So I will go ahead and skip over that chapter there. Moving down, buyer's default. If the buyer defaults, they're going to lose their money, pretty much. Seller default. If the seller defaults or refuses to close, they lose their money. Excuse me, they have no claim and the buyer's money goes back to the buyer. Dispute resolution. If there are conflicting demands, let's say they come to an impasse on a term of the contract and there are conflicting demands for the deposit, the buyer and the seller have 10 days to notify the closing agent that they have a conflicting demand in order for the money to be withheld. After that fact, then goes to mediation, and then people get to pay a mediator to help them try and come to terms when they could really just put their differences aside and handle it as a business agreement. Coming to some type of agreement to split the escrow, go one party, go the other party, reimburse the inspection or the appraisal and cut out from there. It's all about just making some type of agreement where nobody really wins at that point because the deal's not going to close. Okay. Any cost for a mediator would be split between both parties. Moving through, title evidence. Again, here, there are no requirements on either party unless there are violations or clouds on title. When there are clouds on title, that's where you get into more of a title curative process for the seller to resolve any of those liens or blocks essentially on them being able to sell the property. Title examination. Remember, we previously talked about a title commitment needing to go from the seller to the buyer, which is not commonly done, but it is in the contract. The buyer has 5 days after receiving that title commitment to examine it and see if there are any defects. Defects meaning it could be subject to an association they were not disclosed. That would be a defect on the title commitment. They were not made aware. That is considered a reason for them to get out. Let's say there's a lien that's on there. So the seller would need to provide the ability to clear that lien prior to closing or at the time of closing. If not, they can be given a term of up to 30 days, which is the cure period as defined here. So let's say they have a tax lien. That's a great example. There's a tax lien on the property. The seller has 30 days to come to an agreement and be able to clear that by closing. If the seller does not cure that tax lien during the cure period, the seller must notify them and the buyer has the ability to get out of the contract. That cure period can be extended up to 120 days before the buyer can really just say, walk away, I'm done. No, I'm thinking like income tax, IRS, correct, not property taxes. That all the property tax kind of stuff can be resolved at closing. I'm thinking more federal.
Seller has certificates for property taxes.
Mhm.
They owe like 2 or 3 years of taxes.
Mhm.
Can they have time to pay that off? Or
No, so if it's a property tax issue, even if there are tax certs that have been sold off, that can all be resolved at closing. That's not necessarily something that has to be cured.
the seller doesn't have the funds to pay for those, you know, $15,000 of taxes?
If the seller proceeds are sufficient enough, they don't need the cure.
But it's not sufficient enough.
Correct. They get paid by the title company at closing.
What's that?
They get paid by the title company at closing.
Right, but let's say there wasn't enough funds there.
If there's not enough funds in the seller proceeds, then yes, that would be considered a defect on the marketable title, and the seller would be given time to cure that or come up with the money to cure those.
The buyer's still committed to stay in the contract.
Yes, the buyer is still committed into the contract.
Let's say that there's a big mortgage,
Mhm.
and you owe $25,000 of tax,
Yes,
and you know, turns out the seller's got funds. That buyer's still committed to wait 2 months.
the buyer is actually committed to up to 120 days to allow the seller to cure that stuff.
Seller can't then wait for it.
Correct. Wait, let me give you a full explanation here, okay? So if there is an issue like that on the title, the seller has 30 days to cure that. The buyer can say, I will wait for you to do that and hold them to the contract up to 120 days. After the 120 days, the seller can say, I couldn't do it, I'm out.
But the seller could still after 30 days change their mind.
The seller could change their mind. No, the buyer has the option to push it to 120 days. Correct. Yes.
Buyer, I'm sorry to clarify that. Buyer,
I'm listening. The buyer's committed for mandatory 30 days to cure.
and after 30 days,
The buyer can say, I'll wait longer and give them 120.
the buyer doesn't want to, then they're already committed, they only have to stay 30 days, and that's it.
Correct. Correct. It's a bit complex. Essentially, if you come up with an issue like that and you need to cure, it could be something with code violations. For example, there was a triplex I had to get involved with that it was a $190,000 triplex. Not in the best area, we'll say. Okay. And there were code violations totaling $500,000 in fines. That's a title defect, and there's not enough money there to take care of it. So we had to go through a process with the city and the special magistrate to do a partial release, removing the violation fines and reducing that to administrative cost. That took 97 days to do. 97. The buyer was getting a deal, so they wanted to hang on. They gave us 120 days. And they reduced it to $2,500 from 500 plus thousand. Yeah. The idea from the city is not necessarily to collect on the fines. It's to get the stuff corrected. So they were failing to pull permits for air conditioners. It was certain maintenance needed on fences and the exterior of the building, minor stuff. They want the stuff to get fixed. They want properties to look good. They're not trying to collect $500,000 on a $200,000 property. That's not reasonable. There is a process set in place to do that. No, the seller paid the $2,500, correct. That's fine. So if the seller wants to sell it as is, they're disclosing that there are some issues, that's okay. Additional terms is where you would put that information. Buyer is accepting property with any liens, encumbrances, code violations, open permits. Instead of putting that other clause, you change it around where buyer accepts any open or expired permits, code violations, or liens as part of the closing. And at closing, they'll sign a hold harmless agreement. Well, the buyer would have to be responsible for taking care of that stuff. They can still get a title policy. However, the liens and code violations, stuff like that, will be placed as exceptions to the title policy. So they'll still get title, which covers them partially on other stuff, but it won't cover them on any of those items. Whenever you're signing a hold harmless, they become exceptions to the title policy.
Public examination there. 5 days after received title commitment?
Correct, because all of the issues that we're talking about now will be on the title commitment.
So my question is, if title commitment is issued on the day of closing,
They're already in default. The seller is already in default. Because remember that clause we talked about before, the seller has 15 days or 5 if it's a cash deal to provide a marketable title commitment.
no title commitment is given until the day of closing, that's when they can start providing the title policy and everything else.
That's the actual policy. The title commitment comes within a few days of opening a file.
The day before closing, the buyer's looking at the title commitment,
Mhm.
they got it, they have an out right there.
Yes, if the buyer doesn't get a title commitment until closing, that is a potential out. Okay, moving down. Survey, we talked about surveys before. If the seller has a copy of the survey, they will provide that to the buyer for the buyer to review and possibly recertify, which could save them some money. It is a much lesser expense if you are recertifying a survey rather than doing a completely new one. Yes. Does the buyer have to pay the seller for their survey? No. If the buyer would like to reuse that survey and recertify, yes, that would be a buyer expense. Why does this keep doing that? Okay, moving down. Lease information. If you remember at the top, we talked about the lease, the actual copy of the lease. Down here is where we were talking about the tenant estoppel. 10 days prior to closing, the seller will furnish to buyer estoppel letters from the tenant specifying the duration of occupancy, rental rate, any advanced rent like last month, or security deposits that have already been paid. So those can be accounted for as part of the closing. If the seller is unable to obtain such letters, which the letters are actually filled out by the tenant, so it's what the tenant's understanding is, so there's no confusion after the fact. The buyer has 5 days after receiving this information to reject what was provided to them pretty much. So that 5 days we had at the beginning of the contract for the basic lease information now comes back at the back end for the tenant estoppel information. So you have the first 5 days to get a copy of the lease and then 5 days to review that. And at the ending here, we have 10 days prior to closing to get the tenant estoppel information, then 5 days to review that. Really, this only comes up if the property is an investment property, and you'll get the majority of this information at the front end of the contract anyways. So this doesn't really come up too much at the end of things, more at the beginning. Liens. At closing, the seller will furnish to a buyer an affidavit specifying that there's been no changes within 90 days of the closing, that there's no obligations, there's no liens, that the place is free and clear. They don't know of anything that is there. And that is a document that is always signed by seller at closing. It's called the closing affidavit and instructions. You'll see that as every part of every seller's documents. So God forbid something does come back after the fact that they did something within 90 days and it created a lien on the property that is now being passed on to the buyer. The buyer has that documentation to be able to go back to the seller and get them to rectify. Okay. Section F, time. Calendar days are used in computing all time periods. Time is of the essence, other than acceptance dates and effective dates. Everything else here may not end on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday. Your effective date can be a Saturday. Your acceptance date can be a Saturday. So if you put today that they have 48 hours for acceptance, that would end on Saturday and it stays on Saturday. That does not progress to the following business day. Same thing with effective date. If they return the contract to you on Saturday, Saturday can be your effective date. Everything else, all other time periods, end on a business day. Does that make sense? Cool. If the deposit is due and the date ends on a Sunday, it moves to the following business day at 5 p.m. Okay, effective date was Saturday. 3 days would be Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. So Tuesday would be the end of your escrow. Yes. If Monday is a holiday, no, it would still be counted. So let's use this weekend as an example. We have Labor Day on Monday. Contracts accepted on Saturday. That's your effective date. Okay. Sunday is day one. Monday is day two. Tuesday is day three. It still is Tuesday. Let's say they accepted it on Friday and Labor Day is Monday. Saturday is day one. Sunday is day two. Monday is day three. However, day three is a holiday, so it goes to 5 p.m. on Tuesday. Okay. Next section, force majeure. This is when hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, wars, insurrections, and acts of terrorism could prohibit you from closing. For example, right now, we are in Florida in the cone from Key West to Jacksonville. Everybody's in the cone. So there is a point where insurance underwriters will stop bonding policies. If that is the case and the insurance has not been paid for or bonded, essentially, insurance is not available at the time of closing, you are not able to close. In that case, the closing will automatically be extended for a reasonable time up to 7 days when that insurance provider is now writing policies again for you to be able to close. If your time period, or let's say there's something catastrophic here, okay? God forbid, there's something catastrophic and 7 days is not long enough. You have 30 days beyond closing date in order to close. However, if 30 days is still not enough time, either party may terminate this contract and all deposits be refunded. Okay? We won't have that circumstance come up. What you'll most likely be using, God forbid we do need to, is that 7-day period. You had a question?
Unusual transportation delays. You can lock your keys in the car. Does that count?
Locking your keys in your car is not an unusual transportation delay. We have Uber. It would be like road closures, like all roads leading to the settlement location have been shut down and blocked, things like that. Those are unusual transportation delays. It's really in South Florida, it's extreme weather, it's hurricanes, floods, electricity, things like that. All right. Continuing, I'm going down to the next section that actually could impact things. Prorations and credits. This is an interesting one. So typically at a closing, a property tax bill is prorated to the date of closing using the prior year's tax bill as the estimation number. This clause actually survives closing after the fact. So as we stand right now, let's say we're closing now in August. We're using the 2018 tax bill as an estimation as to what the prorated bill would be for 2019. Let's say tax bill comes out and it's actually $1,000 more. The proration is different and the buyer was shortchanged on the credit they got from the seller. This clause actually allows the buyer to come back to the seller and collect the difference in the proration after closing. And the seller at closing, as part of that same document we mentioned before, is signing that they agree to work with the buyer on a prorated difference should it be different. When does that actually happen? Almost never. I've seen it once. When it was a homesteaded property, they moved, the homestead was ported to the new property, so it was removed for the tax year, and the taxes went up $2,500. The buyer went back and collected the prorated difference from the seller after many, many conversations and days of explaining to them what their obligations were. Usually it doesn't happen, but it's interesting to know that and understand how it could affect things. It won't stop you from closing, but it could affect your relationship with the buyer or seller after the fact. Usually the closing agent or closing attorney will explain this as part of signing the documents. Hopefully they don't just throw it in front of them and make them sign. And they explain that, yes, you're agreeing to prorate this again in the future should the taxes change significantly. Moving on. FIRPTA, the FIRPTA section. It is a very good idea if you are on the seller side to confirm with your seller if they are a U.S. national or a foreign person. If they are a foreign person, it is good to understand the FIRPTA exemptions and what that obligation might be. FIRPTA is a requirement when the seller is a foreigner to collect anywhere between 5 and 15% of the sales price and submit that to the IRS. That is not your obligation as a realtor. That is the title company's obligation to withhold and ask that question to the seller, but it is good knowledge for you to have. Great question. How do you know what the difference is? So there's different tiers based on pricing. The 5% is towards the lower end, and the 15% is up when you're over $1 million. Now, there are exceptions to this. FIRPTA does not apply no matter how foreign your seller is. If the property is for sale under $300,000, the sales price is under $300,000, and the buyer will be occupying the property. So essentially, if it's not investor to investor and it's under $300,000, the buyer is then signing an affidavit saying, yes, we're going to occupy the property, and they're assuming the responsibility, and the seller is free and clear. Does that make sense? Moving on. If you have questions about that with specific circumstances, your seller is a foreigner. When you give it to the title company, consult with the attorney. Okay? Now, addenda. This is the biggest issue I see on contracts. You're writing up an as-is contract. You must utilize the addenda that correspond with this contract. The reason being, in those addenda, you will find clauses that refer to clauses on the principal contract. If you're using the wrong format of an addendum, it will refer to clauses that have nothing to do with it. For example, I don't believe it's the appraisal one. It might be the appraisal one. That refers to clause 8B on the principal contract. On the as-is, clause 8B is your financing contingency. On the standard purchase contract or the CRISP contract, 8B has nothing to do with financing. So if you use the wrong addendum, it will correspond to a clause that has nothing to do with it, thereby rendering your addendum pretty useless, which is an error on your part, then goes into ethical issues and license violations. So it's important that you are operating with full competence to what you're doing and pay attention to the contract addenda that you are utilizing. If it's an as-is contract, all of your addenda will start with the contract code CR- a number. Right now, you can see on the bottom of the as-is contract, we're on revision number 5. In the bottom left-hand corner, it says as-is 5X. So all addenda that correspond with this will be CR-5. When a new revision comes out, it will be as-is 6, and all corresponding addenda would be CR-6. If you're using a standard purchase contract, all of your addenda will say CRSP. It's important to understand the difference. Another way to see if you're being accurate with your addenda is right here on the last page in section 19, there's a list of all the common addenda. It's not just listed by letter to be in order. It's listed by letter because they correspond to the title of the addenda. For example, if I'm using the condominium rider, at the top of the condominium rider, it will say A, condominium rider, because that is how it's defined and linked in here. So if I'm attaching that, I will check the box, and then as part of my contract package, I will include the A condominium rider. That's the easiest way to know if you're matching up contract to addenda appropriately. Okay? Any questions about those? The most common addenda would be condo, homeowners, FHA, VA financing, lead-based paint, of course, housing for older persons when it's 55 or 62 plus. And I am also a very big fan of the kick-out clause and the sale of buyer's property as part of protecting your different customers. The kick-out clause, I'm going to review the kick-out clause in a separate training video when I go over each individual addendum. I'm just going to record those and put those on our YouTube channel. But the kick-out clause I really like. It essentially, if you have a buyer submit an offer on your listing with a lot of contingencies, like the sale of their property, could be appraisal, could be buyer's attorney's approval, a myriad of different contingencies, the kickout clause gives the seller the power to continue to market the property for sale. And if they get a backup offer, they can force the first buyer to either put down more money and accelerate their contingencies, or remove their offer and take the second one. It gives them 3 days to do so. It's pretty neat. If you have a motivated seller who wants to make sure they're locking in a contract. Additional terms. The additional terms can be a gift and a curse. Anything you write into the additional terms, you're going to be liable for. So when you start writing stuff into the additional terms, you're essentially acting as an attorney. If your buyer suffers a financial loss because of what you put in there, it's an issue. It's a big issue for you. So be very careful about what you're putting in there. If you're unsure about what you're putting in or what you're writing, send it through us. I'll go review it with the attorney, and we'll make sure that you're putting in something that is very all-encompassing. One of my favorite things to do in the additional terms, and this is to increase your ability to get your buyer's offer accepted, especially in a multiple offer scenario, is called an escalation clause. You guys heard of an escalation clause? You have? Okay, cool. You're looking at me like I'm speaking Chinese over here. Okay. Yes, the escalation is what helps you get to the second floor of the mall. No. So an escalation clause is a term which we do have a pre-printed clause in there for you. That was drafted and reviewed by, it was drafted by me, but reviewed by an attorney. And I did take it from another association of realtors in Washington, D.C. Anyhow, so what the escalation clause essentially says is, here is our offer at X price. However, if you get another offer that nets you more money, we're willing to go $1,000 over that offer up to X amount. So let's say I'm making my offer at $500,000, but my buyers really want this house. They're just chomping at the bit to get this house, and it's a multiple offer scenario. They say, we want this so bad, I would pay $10,000 over asking price. Okay, solid, let's get it. I'm gonna put an escalation clause in there, which says our offer at the top was $500,000. However, if you receive another offer, my buyer is willing to pay $1,000 more than that, up to a total purchase price of $510,000. So what you'll see in this clause is if this escalation clause will be exercised, meaning the seller is saying, we got another offer at $505,000. So that means your escalation clause kicks in and you're at $506,000. Okay. In order for that to take effect, that last line states, in the event another offer causes the escalation clause to apply, the seller will provide the buyer with a copy of such offer, removing any personal or identifiable information from that other buyer. So in order for this to take effect, they need to send me the other contract, but they can scratch out the name of the buyer and the name of the agent. That is their proof that they got another offer. As far as how honest that is, can't really govern over that. But you're giving your buyer the best chance to get the property. They will never walk away saying, we didn't do everything we possibly could to get that offer. And this is something that is not commonly used. It's not commonly known. So you will likely be the only escalation offer in there. You have a question first, then I'll come to you. So your question is, if you have an accepted offer and you're moving towards closing, the seller can't accept another offer. They can receive offers during the entire time of the period until you actually close. They can't sign and accept another formal offer. They could accept a backup offer, but that could also be utilized to escalate the contract. So let's say we're at 500,000, they accepted our 500,000, and I had that escalation up to 510, right? Let's say they get another offer 20 days in. They could exercise that, and that brings up a good point actually. They could exercise that escalation clause 20 days in and bring your offer up to 506. So my recommendation and how I'm actually going to modify this clause for you guys now is to put a time date on that. until full acceptance or until the end of the inspection period, something like that. Yeah.
Right, because when the offer is accepted and it's sold, the seller can have all of a sudden say, oh, I have another offer. Then
Correct.
escalation clause comes in.
This is how I probably add it. I'll run this by the attorney, but I would have the clause expire once the contract's accepted. That's a great point to bring up. Thank you. Joseph, you had a question? It's very crafty clause. Completely legal. Yep.
Are you putting this transaction?
It's in both.
So you advise that this can be used for, we're working with some investors and dealing with competing offers.
Right.
Concern is about integrity and the fact that the other sellers will come back and say, oh yeah, we got, like we say, we'll pay up to, let's say the property's on the market for 90,000. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to pay up to 100. Sometimes you feel like, they're going to try and take advantage. Okay, we'll take the 100, and we got an offer for 400, we'll take your offer. So the only way to prove that is they'd have to provide another offer.
They have to provide a copy. So you have to think about this. In anything involving the contract, there's always the ability for someone to be unethical or lie or fail to disclose or conceal. There's always that possibility. We can't really look at it with that perspective. We kind of have to have a little bit of faith in the process and that they're giving us an offer that is actually legitimate. Obviously, it would have to have the property address on there and have to have the price on there in order for that to really be effective. But they can cross out the name, all that kind of stuff. It's really impossible for you to check the validity of that.
And in regards to that last sentence,
But if your buyer was willing to pay that price as opposed to what they offered, they'll be happy anyways because they got the property. They wanted it enough to get the property and pay a premium for it.
the final sentence that you put in,
Right?
the clause shall expire.
I'm going to run that by the attorney, the final sentence I put in there, just to see if he would tweak that at all. He probably will. Just simplify the mentality behind it is if they don't exercise it before signing the contract, that it's going to go away, that they won't be able to do it during the inspection period if they get a backup offer or anything like that. We don't want them coming back during the process.
Right, so it's this clause shall survive until acceptance of our buyer's offer.
Right, which is the effective date. So it's 6 in one hand, half dozen in the other. I'm wondering if he wants me to use different terminology instead of shall expire, or this clause shall be deemed acceptable upon exercising of the right and or effective date, whichever comes sooner, something like that, whichever occurs earlier. I need some terminology from him on that.
That was very popular when the housing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep,
Because
they were.
Yeah, I remember that. That's
Yeah.
why I looked at you. Exactly.
Yeah, escalation clauses were big when the market had tanked and there were multiple offers from investors on every property. And you're seeing it more again now as it becomes more competitive for buyers. Again. Yeah, that's what we're referring to. This is during your time of offer that you want to put this in. No. We want it to expire once the offer is accepted so they can't come back and increase the purchase price after the fact. Okay? Almost there, guys. Continuing down. Obviously, this is a signature section that all buyers and all sellers, as listed in the top seller and buyer section, would sign here. If it's a husband and wife, both have to sign. One does not satisfy. Okay? And the last section here, these are not signature places for the brokers or agents to sign. It's merely registering who the agents are on each side of the transaction. Do not put a percentage. You cannot attempt to change the offer of compensation in here. None of this stuff will govern over anything. So if you put your name and your broker, for example, and there was a 2.5% commission offered in the MLS, but you put your information at 3% here, and you're thinking, yes, they all signed it, I'm getting 3%. it means nothing. The offer of compensation is as stated in the MLS. That will not change. So don't put it in here. It is actually a violation of our code of ethics to place the percentage in here. Nobody ever calls anyone out on it. Some people freak out when they put the wrong percentage. It doesn't really matter. Don't worry about it. Make sure your name is there and your company is there and move on. Okay? Any questions about the contract in general?
On the homeowners association,
Mm-hmm.
and then, were you saying that it's not required to have an approval by the homeowners association?
It depends. So is it required to have an approval from the homeowners association? It depends on the rules and regulations of that homeowners association. There's not a requirement to provide covenants, rules, and restrictions from the seller to the buyer on a homeowners association.
I think it is on the Addenda.
I'll pull it up after. We'll talk about it. It is not a requirement for the seller to provide to the buyer. The only requirement is that addendum itself.
That's what I thought. The bylaws is still required to be passed on.
We'll talk about that after. Okay, seeing no questions, I'm going to cut this. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. And I love you all.